like I said, concerns, thoughts, uh, issues with this?
Well,
Just be
I think this too is going to vary significantly, depending on the district and the region, as students go back. But I have several concerns. I'm hoping that, when districts and schools reopen their doors to students, that they are implementing, really good crisis response protocols that help us to screen students who may be at risk for mental health, difficulties, and respond to them immediately. And I think we have to recognize that this time outside of school, regardless of how long it is, has looked and felt, very different for different students. And so I think, implementing those really robust, social emotional screening measures when students, re-enter the doors is important. And I think we have to be ready to be responsive to kids who are struggling. And I think the kids are going to struggle for a number of reasons. I think there's going to be kids who are struggling with return to that social setting, after being isolated for a while. I think there's kids that are going to be pretty anxious about coming back, whether it's anxious about, physical health or anxious about their academic performance relative to their peers. So I think we have to be ready for that, and I think we have to be ready to respond. And then also, the crisis response team member in me also, is reminding people that kids are resilient, and the natural response is to respond in a way that is healthy and appropriate. And as adults, we can, support students in building and also demonstrating that resiliency. And so we also want to be careful to not to assume that all students have been traumatized by this. And, so we have to be ready to adapt and differentiate our response, to students.
Yeah, I love what Shauna just said. She really framed it perfectly. And I'd say on the East Coast, the only difference is that in schools, quite often the adults have a lot of answers. A child will ask a question and they'll say, well, in my experience, or I know the answer is this, or we've planned really well and here's what we're going to do. And right now, we just don't have the answers. The adults, really don't know what the future looks like. And so we're waiting, or it's changing every day, or we're making three plans for, each scenario. But to kind of amplify what Shauna was saying, that whole piece around crisis preparedness and sometimes what we'll call multi-tiered systems of support, the idea of here are a universal set of things we're going to do for every student to kind of buffer that, or encourage that resiliency or buffer that trauma, and then we're going to work really hard at identifying who are the kids that are at risk, and then continue to identify who are the kids that are really in crisis that we'll need to apply resources for. And I think, especially within NASP, there's a lot of science and research around like post traumatic growth or trauma informed care, trauma informed school systems. And I think we're just starting now to kind of share a lot of that. It feels like it's the appropriate time to start having conversations with, school districts and school psychologists across the country to say, here are the really important elements of those things that you want to make sure that when it's appropriate to open up and return, that you're thinking about these things. And I think, states like Montana give us here in New York a little hope.
It's funny when you're talking about making plans. I don't know why I just had this like flash of I remember Mike Tyson used to talk about everyone's got a plan till they get punched in the face.
Yes, I love that quote.
I love that. So I was just thinking about this because I was thinking of a friend of mine who's an educator here in Connecticut, works at a school that my son goes to, Southern Connecticut State University. And he mentioned the idea that, yes, everyone's making all these plans about going back to school, but, and whether it being like a hybrid or whatever version, but what happens when that first student gets test positive? Then what? Like, then, you have to have plans on top of the plans. And then how do you address, the mental health? Are the other students, do people get upset? Do they, there's a lot to manage in this. Like,
Mhm.
it's,
Yeah,
again, we could talk about this for hours.
yeah, and I hope it's not sort of a tangent, but someone recently asked me, like, have schools ever had to deal with something like this? And other than 9/11 or perhaps a school shooting that occurs, I don't think there's ever been anything this, grand of a trauma for, students in schools. And maybe there's weather related issues in certain parts of the country and stuff that as well. But the result of every one of those is just really good, planning that happens in schools. And then we share that with other educators. And I think the way Shawna was describing before, schools are really good at are great at adapting, right, and using best practice of what's out there. I don't think we have any of those answers just yet for a pandemic.
It really underscores our need to be nimble, because so many of the plans and the protocols that we've developed, they're a good framework, but they're not necessarily going to be the plan. And like you said, there needs to be a plan on top of a plan. At a meeting the other day, and people were talking about a return to school, and at the time we didn't even know if schools would be allowed to reopen. And I likened it to trying to, design your home when you hadn't even built the lot, or maybe didn't even know what area of the country you were going to build it in. I mean, you can have some ideas, you're going to need a kitchen, but you can't really design it. My husband's an architect, can you tell? That until and I was just really cautioning, like, let's talk about some of the best practice things, let's talk about some of the
Mhm.
things that we know we're going to need, but let's not go down a rabbit hole of scenarios and what ifs, without having more information. And because in some ways that almost enhances the anxiety that people have about this. So I think we have that foundation. We look to the best practices. We share that information as people start to engage in this experiment or adventure of reopening the doors, and we just try to learn from one another.
Um, you made me think. We were talking to we do a virtual roundtable each week, and we were talking to different educators. And a few weeks ago, Richard Carranza, the chancellor in New York City Department of Education, was on, and he talked about the idea of never waste a crisis, right? And trying to learn some lessons from this. So maybe, guys, I kind of want to, wind down a little bit here. Maybe, what are some maybe lessons in terms of mental health and remote learning that we can kind of take from this whole situation? Or are there any lessons?
School psychologist, I think the opportunity that we're presented here is to highlight and reinforce the role that we have in schools as mental and behavioral health providers. And as school psychologists, a lot of the work that we do can be focused on student assessment, and that is an important role. And it's not the only role. And I think when we haven't been able to engage in those kinds of practices, it's really served to highlight the other kinds of important work that we do. And oftentimes that's the work that I think educators maybe more broadly are not aware of, but has become incredibly more important. So I think the opportunity in our profession as school psychologists is really to speak to our role as mental and behavioral health providers. And I think that school psychologists are stepping up to the plate. And I think that NASP is providing a lot of resources to help them to do that. I think as educators more broadly, the opportunity is to really self-reflect on some of the inequity that has become apparent through this, because we know that those are not things that just impact kids during a school closure. Those are things that kids face every day. And what I hope that we take out of this is really looking at some of those gaps. And I hope that we use that information to help address those achievement gaps that we know exist. And I hope that we use it as an opportunity to really reflect on how some of our practices might serve to even broaden those achievement gaps for kids. And so I hope that we're looking at ways to minimize some of those barriers to education that kids have, because those exist outside of a pandemic. The pandemic has highlighted those for us, but those have existed, and they will continue to exist after this. So that's what I hope we learn in education more broadly. And I hope that we're able to make some changes that really reduce those barriers and enhance access to quality education for all kids, no matter the circumstance.
Kind of looking forward and thinking about the fall, what maybe one thing that maybe either we haven't talked about yet, but is worth mentioning to kind of keep in mind going forward? Is there anything that you could think of that, I mean, we have touched upon a lot of stuff, but maybe something that we haven't,
Mhm.
or one thing you feel maybe even bears repeating kind of going forward?
I know the one thing that maybe seems to be a topic of conversation right now, and as I said, if we had this conversation a week or a month from now, we might have new insights. But one is that while there are so many remarkable things that schools are set up for, all of the support and resources, the way we started today's conversation, I think having the idea that we might be able to do things slightly differently, or that we might have some flexibility. I think about the school day being 8 to 3, and bells telling us this class starts and that class starts. Whether or not there might be some changes in some of those structures, and we might be forced to have them in the fall. But I think if they were good for kids, if they were good for teachers, if they accounted for the opportunity to layer on more supports and resources for kids, then I think those would be really important takeaways in the future.
Yeah, I think that is such a good point, Peter, because in some ways it's like if we miss this opportunity to self-reflect, I mean,
Mm.
we don't take anything away from this, and we go back to a traditional, 7 period, 8 to 4 day. I think we will have really missed an opportunity to note some of those practices that have been good for kids, and things that have maybe been good for families, and things like that. I think that's an excellent point. The other thing I think about is just where schools fit within communities more broadly, and I do think that as we mentioned earlier, it's really highlighting that education is more than just the academics. But I do hope there's an opportunity to continue to talk within our communities about where public education fits within those communities, and what role we serve, and how we just continue to improve what we're doing to support kids and families.
Yeah, that adage of absence makes the heart grow fonder. I feel like when I
Yeah.
talk to parents and students, they're missing school.